Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is the show where every week I look at work that was an influence to James Ellroy, work that thrilled him, moved him, inspired him. I have a great episode for you today, but first, I'm rather like Grace Jones in that I'm a slave to the algorithm. That's why I want you to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and you'll get the content every episode delivered straight to your inbox, but also you'll help me to continue to produce this show and keep bringing you great content. Okay, so my book for this week's episode is The Black Echo by Michael Connelly. Now, when I was working on James Ellroy's biography, Love Me First in Danger, The Life of James Ellroy, Ellroy told me that he had yet to meet or to read one of Michael Connelly's books. Since then, in the interceding years, that has changed. He has met him and he has read him, I know that. And in fact, their life has many connections and parallels. Michael Connelly says that his novels are like one big canvas where the characters are, interrelated, or that they're moving in directions where their paths often cross. And I'll be going a little bit into that. But first, The Black Echo. So The Black Echo was Michael Connelly's first novel. And it was the novel that introduced his trademark character, Hieronymus Harry Bosch. And a little bit about Michael Connelly's backstory. He was born in Philadelphia, but he was raised predominantly in Florida. His father worked in construction, but was something of an aspiring artist. His mother loved crime fiction and encouraged him to read as much as possible. In fact, both of his parents encouraged him to pursue his dream for a career as a creative artist, which is very refreshing because I think many artists or creators of any kind could say that the parents would warn them off this life. It's a very tricky life, but it's worth it if you've got the passion. And as Stephen King once said, when he asked what made him become a writer, he responded, "What makes you think I had a choice?" Anyway, so Michael Connelly's life, he grew up with a fascination from crime. He said one day he was walking back home from his job as a hotel dishwasher, and he saw someone running away and throwing a lumberjack shirt into a bush, and he retrieved the shirt himself and found that there was a gun wrapped inside it. He reported it to the police. He didn't really see how the case developed from there, but one can only assume that his imagination would fill in the gaps as to the story behind that gun, what happened next, the police investigation, the crime. All manner from heaven for, a writer with big dreams. Anyway, he developed a very successful career as a journalist and was actually a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his work for the Los Angeles Times covering the Delta 191 flight crash. He wrote a couple of novels which he didn't try to get published. I suppose he was learning his trade. And then finally, his third attempt at writing a novel, The Black Echo, which he did get published, went on to amazing success, won the Mystery Writers of America Edgar Award for Best First Novel. And he's been writing Bosch novels ever since, and also numerous other characters he's developed into series characters. So the story behind The Black Echo is that we meet Harry Bosch. He is a detective with Robbery Homicide Division. He's had a very successful career in the LAPD, but not without controversy. He was caught, he solved the Dollmaker serial killing case. That's his backstory. And there's actually even been a TV series made out of one of his cases, and that's why he lives a very upper middle class, expensive lifestyle for a policeman, and he's got a house in Mulholland Drive, or the Hollywood Hills. And the case we're working on, this one in The Black Echo, is that they find a body in the tunnels underneath Los Angeles, and it's of someone he knew, someone who he served with as a tunnel rat in Vietnam. And Bosch's backstory, obviously, he's had a very good military career, and now he's having a very good LAPD career, but it's not that way for many Vietnam veterans. Now, he'd lost track of this guy, but he knew the guy wasn't doing very well. And then he finds him dead, and he feels, obligated, not to investigate, not just as a policeman, but also the obligation one feels to, a comrade in arms. So the story goes in some interesting directions. The title, The Black Echo, refers to what the tunnel rats called it when you were in the tunnels. The Viet Cong could be anywhere, and the darkness, the smell, the atmosphere, the fear, that all goes into creating this black echo atmosphere. As the clear case develops, Bosch starts a relationship with a FBI agent, Eleanor Wish, because the case goes into that the tunneling under LA is being used as for a series of bank robberies, which is federal crime. And we meet stock characters who become, very, very important in the Bosch series, such as his colleague and friend in the LAPD, J. Edgar. And really, it's more than just a murder mystery or a detective novel. It really goes into kind of the political issues of the day. So this is the early 90s. So Vietnam veterans were obviously very numerous and also now, middle-aged, and how roughly they've been treated. Also, by society, the difficulties they've had adjusting. Also, the Vietnamese population in LA. And the case itself is fascinating. Where Bosch goes in terms of his backstory, this is where it begins to relate to James Ellroy, because Michael Connelly actually wrote a letter to James Ellroy saying, I have this character. I want to develop his backstory. I want him to have a murdered mother and to be haunted by this, and for it to be a mystery that's going to plague him throughout the novels. Now, can I use the story of Jean Ellroy, your murdered mother, to do that? And Ellroy's response was, very enthusiastic and, proactive. He said to him, his exact words, were, I don't hold the patent on murdered mothers. So in other words, go ahead. Now, I've always liked that story because firstly, it shows Michael Connelly did not have to write to James Ellroy to begin with. He could have just taken the inspiration. He was never going to get sued for that one way or another, but he was courteous. He wanted to acknowledge Ellroy as the influence. And in turn, Ellroy was very generous. He could have either ignored the letter, or he could have, or he could have said no. He's just like, it's trauma for me. Why should you intrude on it? But no, he was very, very generous and, proactive in letting Michael Connelly use that influence. So there are many other connections between Ellroy and Connelly. One of the models for Bosch was the LAPD detective Rick Jackson. And there's some debate as to whether he was a model for Bosch, but he's very, very close with Michael Connelly. In fact, they've recently worked on a true crime project together. And Rick Jackson was one of Ellroy's very best friends in the LAPD. Has worked as a technical consultant on a lot of Hollywood projects related to the LAPD, and has really been like a font of knowledge to Ellroy himself. He was a very, very close friend. Bill Stoner, who helped Ellroy with My Dark Places and the reinvestigation into his mother's murder, worked for Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and Jackson was to Ellroy what Stone was in the LASD. Just extremely close. At one point, they did have a falling out, Jackson and Ellroy, but they patched it up. They as Ellroy told me, he's like, we just started talking again, and that was, he said, just felt so good just to talk to the friend again after they hadn't spoken in some time. And I knew that Ellroy had a lot of fallings out, and they didn't always end up like that. They didn't always end up with them patching things up. So that was nice. Another connection between Ellroy and Michael Connelly is that when Michael Connelly's novel Bloodwork was adapted for the screen by Clint Eastwood, Eastwood chose Brian Helgeland to adapt the novel. And the reason being is that Eastwood had been so impressed, and I got this from Brian Helgeland himself. Eastwood had been so impressed at the way Brian Helgeland had adapted LA Confidential into film format, because the way he whittled that novel down was with three main characters and something like 80 secondary characters, and at least a dozen subplots interlocking. And Michael Connelly himself says he works on a very broad canvas. In fact, we don't learn much about the mother character in the first novel, The Black Echo, but Bosch mentions her sometimes. He mentions that her gift to him was the famous Bosch painting Hell, with that big canvas that he has in his home. I suppose that reminds him a little bit of LA, because you have all the sorted, weird, and wonderful characters in LA, and it is something like a modern day hellscape. And that's why she gave him the name Hieronymus. She just loved Bosch's paintings, and but Harry, I think, rolls off the tongue a bit better. Can you imagine being called Hieronymus in school? Well, I don't know if it's the same in the US schools, like it is in British schools, where they take the register every morning and they read out your full name. And if you've got a daft name, that's when you're really going to get it from the other pupils. But yeah, there are lots of connections between Ellroy and Michael Connelly. And in the last few years, I know Ellroy has read Michael Connelly, and he actually met Michael Connelly when Ellroy was awarded the Robert Kirsch Award for Lifetime Achievement a couple of years ago. And Michael Connelly presented it to him and interviewed him on stage in a retrospective about Ellroy's career. And actually, that was a little bit worrying at the time. Actually, a few Ellroy fans wrote to me afterwards, because Ellroy looked quite gaunt and quite thin at that appearance. And we'd stopped working together by that stage because the biography was out. But a few people wrote to me afterwards and said, "Is Ellroy all right?" I was concerned about him, and I said, "Yeah, I think he's okay. He's got typical couple of ailments that any septuagenarian has. Don't worry too much." And subsequently, in some of his appearances, Ellroy has made sense. He's been on much more kind of fiery demon dog form, really holding the audience enraptured. So that was interesting. But anyway, The Black Echo. It's the first Bosch novel. I think it's one of the best. The Bosch series has obviously become huge. Viewers of this show are probably more than aware, fans of crime fiction, probably more than aware of the Bosch TV series, where Bosch is played by Titus Welliver. That was a smash hit series, and it was very, very good. In that one, the character is slightly updated. He's a Gulf War veteran rather than a Vietnam War veteran. And I thought that was really good. And most series of Bosch were based on about 3 novels each, and they would work in interlock the stories, which seems befitting of Connelly's canvas vision. Bloodwork is quite good fun. The only adaptation I really didn't like was Lincoln Loy, which I thought was as dull as ditch water. But the spin-off series of Bosch I haven't watched. I kind of gave up. When Bosch ended, I gave up there. For me, it's Bosch and the Bosch novels. The spin-off series about him being a private eye and his daughter being in the LAPD just didn't appeal to me. I gave up there. But I mean, there are so many of these. Michael Connelly has the gift of being prolific, but also not compromising on quality. These novels are fast-paced. There's a lot of dialogue. The dialogue is always very snappy. It jumps off the page. There's a lot of action. It's rather implausible. Okay, I mean, I will give one gripe about the novel, and maybe all Bosch novels. First of all, it's implausible that any policeman would use his gun that much. You talk to Rick Jackson, talk to Bill Stoner, talk to any of Ellroy's LAPD buddies. They said they never really had occasion to use the weapon. especially when you're a detective. And it's not something they take lightly. They're trained. They take the role very seriously. Obviously, in cop shows, they've got to have that violence in just to keep the viewer interested. Another thing I found a little bit grating about this, and maybe because it's become such a cliche, I mean, this novel is 30 years old, is the way Bosch talks to a senior FBI agent, and you've probably seen the cop film where the detective is called in by the chief of police, and the chief of detectives or whoever says, "Stop breaking the rules. We're getting bad press. Rein yourself in. You're a detective. You're there to enforce the law. Follow the law." And the detective mouths off at him and says, "No, you don't tell me what to do. This case means everything to me. I'm going to solve it by hook or by crook." And of course, they go out and they solve it, and they're vindicated. My gripe with that is, you watch the show. My viewers, I'm sure you have a variety of jobs. Do you torture your boss that way? No, because you'd be sacked. What makes you think that an LAPD detective, which is basically one step removed from the military, could talk to their boss that way? Why do people think that only in the police do detectives have this kind of license to mouth off at superior officers that way? I find it ludicrous. But with Bosch, I find it like Michael Connelly, he just about gets away with it. Maybe because the novels are so zippy, they're so fresh, the refreshingly good reads. And it's his job as an author to just push plausibility just enough so that, the detective is always Bosch is always in a bit more danger than a real detective would be. It's not really a policeman's job to always be in dangerous situations. That's not the purpose of homicide investigation. But like, Connelly knows how to push that just enough where it's just on the right side of implausible, but you're still buying it. And that's what the Bosch novels are. They're just, they are escapist in one way, but in other ways, they're quite gritty, and they're quite insightful about modern day Los Angeles and modern day contemporary America, and they're just great novels, and the connections with James Ellroy, and his novels and his LA Quartet. Ellroy's LA Quartet is much more corrupt, and this much more venal political machine at play. But in many ways, Ellroy's novels could be like Hieronymus Bosch painting. And I'll end on that now. Okay, thank you very much. I will see you next week for another episode of Ellroy Reads. Bye-bye.